Joining me now from London is Io Johnson, a specialist in African affairs who's researched China's investments there. Thank you very much. Io Johnson, the question was asked a bit earlier in Harry Mutasa's report, if this is a fair deal, whether Africans are getting as much out of dealing with China as the Chinese are.
Well, that's a very good question. The reality is that Africa needs element of trade, and the Chinese have been willing to do so. They've expanded, as you've notably mentioned in your report, excessively so across the African continent, which has been quite a good thing, because Africans clearly need that exchange. The question has always been, what is the level of impact that this change is happening? I think in the case of Zimbabwe that you clearly mentioned, China has, like all other donors, have to meet up to their responsibilities to ensure that the pledges that are made are equivalent to receipts on the ground. So that's actually something that's needed urgently. But on the matters that are much wider than that, it shows that Africa is growing. It shows that industrialized nations around the world are quite clear and appreciate Africa in that context, which is why China is willing to engage with Africa in this matter, and very much so. The reason why Hillary Clinton is going around Africa trying to show up the United States position.
Is there an extent to which China is stepping in to fill a need that the Western nations and traditional donor institutions are failing to see and to fill in?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, there's this discrepancy between what's given and what's delivered on the ground. And I think a lot of the smaller agencies who actually carry out a lot of the functions that are expected of industrialized nations have to be blamed here. But I think when we've got to look at the issue of aid, we've got to look at the large swathes of aid which is transferred specifically from government to government. And I think that's where the problem is, because a lot of them don't have strings attached to them. And the mechanisms for government to use the money as they please, it has always been an issue. What we have currently on the African continent is that large numbers of African governments have some element of fragility within their countries. And the question has always been, if you take away that aid, which is crucially required at times, then the fragility, the element of fragility which led to their countries being in the position they find themselves would get that much more apparent and far more worse. I think aid clearly hasn't worked. If you look at 1960s, we had about 10% of the population of Africa living below the poverty line. Currently, we have about 80%.
Io Johnson,
if you look at that disparity...
Right, but it may not have worked, but I just wanted to interrupt you because we're going to run out of time, and I do want to quickly talk about, you mentioned trickle down. Do African workers, for example, see the benefits of all these infrastructure projects that are being built across Africa? I've heard in many different countries that the Chinese investors often bring their own workers in.
That's very correct. A lot of the skilled workers that are required to carry out some of these projects are not on the ground, which means that China would more than likely want to use their own manpower. But I think we've got to look at it in a different way. It shows for once that Africa finds itself in a very unique position, and the position is this. If you have a China who's willing to invest in Africa, if you have a United States who's also showing that willingness, and then you have a Europe who's also showing that, then I think Africa for once has the ability to choose among all these investors to see who can actually benefit them and their communities.
Right.
And I think it increases the currency for Africa altogether.
Thank you very much indeed, Io Johnson.